Thank you all so much for coming out. I just have a couple of little housekeeping things to get out of the way. First off, you wouldn't mind just silencing or turning off phones just to be safe. And second, if you would be so kind as to buy a book at the end. It is what allows us to keep having these free events, and it's what supports the wonderful authors who come and talk. So if you could do that, that would be fantastic. And now I'm just going to quickly, that's the book, to quickly introduce Brinda Charry, who's so lovely as to come out to us tonight. Brinda is a novelist turned academic turned novelist. She's widely published in her other field, which is study of the English Renaissance. But this is her first novel published in the US, and we are so honored to have her here tonight to chat with us about it. Thank you so much.
Do I hold it or
Clip it on, I think.
put it on? Yeah. Thank you. Thanks for coming. And yeah, the East Indian, I've returned to fiction after a long time with the East Indian. The East Indian is a historic novel. It actually came out last year. The reason we're doing this reading now is the paperback was published last month. And the East Indian is a historical novel. And I'm an academic as well as a fiction writer, and my area of study is the English Renaissance. And I knew I wanted to return to fiction, and what I knew is I did not want to write the modern immigrant novel. You know, I thought the modern immigrant novel has been written. It's been written before, Jumpaleri, of course, you know, for the South Asian diaspora. And I knew I did not want to write that. I felt I did not have much to add to the modern immigrant novel. And then I came across some information on this young man who's really the first South Asian person from the Indian subcontinent, what we would call South Asia today, and who shows up in the North American archives. And this is this young man, Tony. And he appears on the American historical record in the year 1635. So it looks like the first East Indian, to use the term, actually came to America in the year 1635, just about 15 years after the first English arrived in the Virginia colony. And he most likely arrived as either a servant or a slave. It's not quite clear. But he was brought over by an Englishman named George Menefee. And George Menefee was a landowner, and he brings a bunch of servants across. And if you look at the Virginia land record, there are the names of all the people he brought across. And of course, you have Dick Smith and John Harper and so on, and Tony East Indian. You know, as is the case with people of color, back in the day, they were not given a last name, you know, simply identified in terms of his ethnic and racial background. And that was fascinating to me, and I decided I would write Tony's life. And of course, there's nothing we know about the historical Tony, apart from the fact he showed up here in 1635. But there are other East Indians who come after Tony. In fact, people, even colonial historians who specialize in American colonial period are not aware of the East Indian presence in North America. And there were East Indians who came in dribs and drabs after that. You find their names in property records and runaway servant ads and that sort of thing. And a couple of them actually even fought in the American Revolution. You know, some on the British side, some on the American side. And so I kind of pieced everything together. And of course, I did extensive reading on colonial Virginia. And I put together this kind of fictional narrative of Tony and what his life could have been like in the year 1635. And I'll start by reading an excerpt from the prologue. Of course, it has to be on a ship, because how else does he get here? And he is, so it starts on a ship. So the young man is on a ship, and yeah. Can you hear me? Am I loud enough? Yeah. Okay. So a witch was hanged from the yard arm of the ship on the 4th week of my voyage to America. Some days before, we had stopped at the isles called the Azores to load wood and fresh water and were well on our way to the New World. They hanged the witch just before dusk. I was among those who gathered to watch as she was led up by 2 sailors, one on either side of her, her legs in chains, although she could not have gone far even if she had tried to flee. Her name was Anne Brady. It was May, and the winds that filled our sails and blew the God's gift towards Virginia were still chilly, but the waters were quite tranquil. Captain Cox had conducted Mistress Brady's trial and had been judge and all the jury. He had set up court on the deck with an eager crowd of sailors and Virginia voyagers pressing around him. Being among the youngest, little Sammy Mason, Dick Hughes and I were at the back of the crowd, straining to see and hear. The 3 of us were of the same age or thereabouts, between 10 and 15, with Sammy being the youngest, Dick being a bit older than I was. Sammy was a slight fellow, smaller even than me, and I was said to be small for my age. His eyes were the lightest I'd seen, bluish-grey, like the sky on a certain kind of day. His hair was a thatch of gold and his face that of a girl. Sammy suffered from ulcers in his mouth through the journey. I recommended some of the medicinal powder I had filched from a London apothecary, but Sammy looked doubtful and would sit with his mouth hanging open just to air out the insides, he said. And Dick and I would keel over with laughter at how foolish he looked. We were boys, and in spite of our unfortunate lot, we could laugh at just about anything. Dick, for his part, was tall and gangly with brown hair and green eyes, his face sorely afflicted with spots. He was good at doing things the sailors asked him to do, things with ropes and such, and one of them said he should consider working on a ship. And then there was myself, the brown-skinned boy, the East Indian who went by the name of Tony. "Where you hail from, lad?" the sailors asked me curiously. "Where your Moor friend from?" they asked Sammy and Dick. "Tony's an Indian from East India, sir," they explained. The sailors always looked surprised at that. "East India is a long way off, even further than America," one of them remarked. It was dawn on that occasion. The ship, which never fully slept, was stirring to renewed life. The distant horizon silently bled red and pink. "It's somewhere that way, I think," I said, pointing eastwards. "Somewhere there." Dick and Sammy squinted at the sky, trying to catch a glimpse of the land from where I had started. "An East Indian," the bosun remarked, looking at me speculatively. "You're the first East Indian sailing to America, lad. Do not know of any who've gone before you." Not knowing whether to be proud at that or dismayed, I smiled uncertainly. "What is Virginia like, sir?" Dick asked. He was not interested in talking about me. "Wood and water," the man replied. "Water and wood." And I imagined green forest and winding river, balanced on the outer edge of the world. So that is how the novel begins, with a hanging of a witch. That did happen historically. I do not know if it happened in the same boat that my young protagonist was on, but I read about a witchcraft trial. A woman was accused of witchcraft, and the trial took place at sea, and she was hanged from the yard arm of a ship in the 1640s. So I decided to use that as the sort of to launch the story, and I kind of circle back to witchcraft later in the story. And I'm going to skip a little bit from the prologue, and I'll read a little bit from later in the prologue. The God's Gift, which is the name of the ship. The God's Gift was a small ship with just 100-odd souls in her, crew and migrants. There was a fair chance of meeting the other passengers in at least once in the course of the crossing. Sometimes even the 2 gentlemen on the ship, Master Warburton and Master Marlowe, stopped us boys for a chat as we scampered across the deck doing chores for the sailors. They were elegant young men with pointed beards, falling lace collars and slashed sleeves, although they were not as wealthy as they looked, so some of the sailors told us, being merely second sons. They were out to make their fortune in the New World. They too were curious about me. "From where do you hail, you little tawny ape?" Master Marlowe asked. "He's a gypsy, I warrant, just like that woman, the witch," Master Warburton ventured, "the kind they used to call Egyptians, one of those who roam the countryside telling fortunes and swindling the folk." "No, sire," I said hastily, "I'm no gypsy," and I explained once again that I was an Indian from East India. Master Warburton then wistfully said he should have gone to East India instead of to Virginia, which was all swamp and sickness from what he had heard. In India, he would have sailed to Surat, met the mighty Mughal, and earned fat rubies just for paying his respects. I had no idea what he was talking about, but feigned I did. The witch and I had exchanged a few words one afternoon while on deck. The passengers were allowed to take the open air once every day or two in smaller groups, but no one wanted to be in Mistress Brady's company, so she walked alone. I had been by myself too, looking over at the water, listening to the creak of the ropes, the groan of the wood, and the sound of the wind slapping against the sails. Mistress Brady had come to stand by my side. She had spoken first and asked me my name. I had told her it was Tony. Her gaze was unwavering. What was it before that, she had asked. What did your mother call you, lad? But I would not tell her. I had lost that name somewhere on my earlier journey, the one that took me across 2 oceans to England. When she saw that a sullen silence was the only response she was going to get, she had not pressed me further. She had placed a hand beside where mine rested on the rail, and I saw that it was nearly as dark as mine, the skin of it rough from labor. I had looked up at her countenance and seen that her eyes were a deep brown, also almost the colour of my own. There were some streaks of grey on her dark head, but there was yet a look of youth about her. At that moment, a sailor had come up and roughly told her to shove off downstairs. She had thrust a piece of salted pork into my hand and ruffled my curls as if I was still a very small child, and then she was gone. So, a witch was hanged 4 weeks into our voyage to Virginia. After it was over, they hauled the body down and flung it into the water. Captain Cox trundled back to his cabin, and they shooed us down to the hold, which stank of stale food, sweat, and vomit, but which was at least rid of the witch's envy and spite. We went on our way, breasting the great grey-white waves, the ship mourning like a living beast, the winds pushing us briskly westwards. It has been many years now since that crossing. But in my mind, she still stands there, forever looking out at the waters, forever asking me my name, forever failing to reach her journey's end. And I, forever poised at the start of my own voyage. It was the year of our Lord 1635, and I, Tony, the East Indian, was the first of my kind, so they say, to reach America. So that is the prologue. And then what I do is I work my way back. The first chapter, it's really only the first chapter of the book that's set in India. And so I go back to his homeland, which is in the Coromandel coast in the southeastern part of India. And the British East India Company has just about started trading with India. And and it's really East India Company officials who were responsible for bringing many of East Indians with them to London. London actually had a fairly, I won't say large, but there were a number of East Indians living in London. And you don't think about it. This is Shakespeare's England. You know, you do not think of, you know, a place like that as having people like East Indians, but there was a population. And so he is, so my protagonist is taken by an East India Company official. And so at the end of the first chapter, he finds himself in London. And the second chapter is set in England, and in London, he's more or less abducted and put on, as was the case with many boys, not just Indian boys, but many poorer English boys were also essentially picked off the streets of London in a practice that was called spiriting, actually. And they were put on these ships and they were taken to Virginia as labor, as indentured labor. And so this young boy, he's just about 11 or 12 at this time. He is put on a ship and he is taken to Virginia, and the rest of the novel is really Virginia. So I wanted to write the story of this young man, but I also wanted to write the story of the sort of the early settlement of Virginia. So my project was really twofold. You know, I wanted to write the life of an individual, but I wanted to write it as part of a larger history, you know, where America was getting settled for the first time. And I mean, getting settled by people of European extraction for the first time. Yeah. Maybe I'll read a section from Virginia, I mean, the rest of the novel is Virginia, but maybe I'll read a part from early on. I intended it to be a kind of, apart from other things, a coming-of-age story, but also an adventure story, you know, where he moves from one adventure to the other. And the first thing is, of course, he is working as a servant in the tobacco fields. And sorry, give me a minute. Okay, I'll read this little bit. There's this young English boy, even younger than Tony, this boy, Sammy, who's just about 8 or 9 years old. And he was actually inspired by my readings of many of little boys who were brought in as indentured laborers. You know, boys as young as 4. You know, children as young as 4 who were brought in as indentured laborers. And this little boy named Sammy is one of the English boys to whom Tony gets very close. So I'll just read a little exchange between him and Sammy. And I start this with a little poem, and the poem did exist back in the day. I did not make up any of the poems or ballads, you know, they did exist back in the day. So there's this little poem, that's a little rhyme that was being passed all over the tobacco plantations. The post that came from Banbury, riding on a red rocket, did tidings tell how Lunsford fell, a child's hand in his pocket. We would sing that ditty in fun, just to frighten Sammy, especially when it grew dark, the shadows fell heavy, and the wilderness pressed upon us. The song had been carried from farm to farm quite recently. There was a man who had been a soldier in England, wandering the countryside, they said, an ogre, a child-eater of a man. And he had consumed the rest of the child? Sammy asked, his blue eyes wide with fear. Yes, though why he left the hand, I do not know. That's the best bit, Cuffy said, and winked. Cuffy is one of the African servants. And Sammy waited in apprehension for the monster to come through the woods and up the soggy path to the cabins. For he would come in the earliest dawn, before the birds woke, on the blaze of the mid-afternoon, when we slogged, taking axes to some trees, burning others, grubbing or breaking up the soil with our hoes, or in the evening when we cooked the corn mush and the watery gruel that barely filled us. The child-eater would come then and rap on the door, sharply. Do not be afeard, Sammy, I said one day, as we brought the hog her feed. He will not come. He would be too frightened of old Ganter, who is the overseer. You think so, Tony? He would not want to come to the stinking hole, I replied. That night, Sammy, who sometimes slept in the cabin with the rest of us, sometimes in the other one with Ganter, picked up where we had left off. He might still be tempted, you know, Tony, the child-eater, if he comes to know there are 3 lads here for him to eat. Sometimes I thought Sammy was a little simple. He certainly looked it now with his round face and popping eyes. But I still felt a tenderness for him. He could not count me as a regular lad. I'm a Moor. My flesh would taste different. And Bristol and Cuffy are black and grown, so he will not be interested in them either. So that leaves only you and Dick. And you both have gotten so wasted working day and night that it would not be worth his while. Sammy contemplated my reply. You know what, Sammy? I said after a short silence that spread out and filled the dark corners of the tiny cabin. I was fatigued suddenly, very, very tired. The child-eater's already here. He's this hard, grinding life, this hunger, these beatings, this savage place. This place and his life are consuming us. There's no other child-eater riding up from Banbury or any place else. Little Sammy nodded. He understood. He was not so simple after all. Shut up, you two, Dick muttered from his corner in the straw. And so we went to sleep. Yeah. So that was meant to, I mean, that incident, like a couple of others, was to show the hardships that these very, very young boys went through all by themselves, far away. And yeah. And another, I don't know, do people ask questions or are there any, or do I just keep reading? Just keep reading?
A little bit more.
A little bit more.
Yes. Was there interaction with Indians?
Because there were very, very few, you know. So, oh, when you say Indians, you mean native?
Yes.
Yeah. Oh, no, I'm sorry. Yeah, there were interactions with native. There is one episode where he goes out west, and again, this was based on something I read about, where this is very, very early colonial Virginia. You should remember the 1630s. And they did not realize the Pacific Ocean is a whole continent away. And they thought if they just go over the mountains, they're going to get to a sea. And so he goes out on this, and then he has a couple of Native American guides. He even lives with them for some time. And he would like to be an Indian among the Indians, but it doesn't really happen because they do exchange him for one of their own. But there is a native. It was hard to write a novel. I mean, I don't think it's right to write a novel on colonial Virginia without bringing in the Native American presence.
So, how do you, I know you will continue reading, but it's all in first person from the point of view of a boy. Was there any difficulty in sort of getting into this kind of character, and speaking in that voice?
Not for me, really. I mean, first, I think children in general, I enjoy writing from the point of view of children. There's something about the child's perspective of the world which is sort of fresh and brutal and uncensored in some ways, and I find that very, very appealing. And the boy part, people have asked me the question, and I think the answer to that is, no, clearly I do not identify as male, but I think there's such a vast body of literature written by, point of view of little boys. I mean, starting with Dickens and Oliver Twist and, I mean, there's a whole body of literature where you have little boys as narrators, and I think I just grew up reading all that. So I think it kind of comes to me, it's just become part of my consciousness. Yeah. Another section in Virginia, I mean, again, I keep saying in Virginia, the whole of the novel is Virginia, but this is another section where he is interacting with some of the other workers, not the little boy, but older people, and some of them who did come on the same ship as him. After a drink or two at the Grey Fox, which is the local tavern, Flynn would sing his favorite ditty, "I'll set my foot in the bottomless ship and sail across the sea," he'd croon soulfully, and the other men hanging about would join him. "When are you coming back, my son? My son, come tell to me." This ballad, by the way, did travel from England, and it is still sung in parts of West Virginia and in the Appalachian Mountains. Yeah. And so they'd lament together for what they'd left behind, for all that was separated from them by an ocean. Their tune was carried on the back of the chilly breeze through the woods and down the river to the seashore, where it lingered waiting. Dick, however, had little time for song, none at all for lamentation. Dick is one of the boys who came in the ship with him. Yes, he was a Londoner, born and bred in the slums of St. Giles. He missed the crops of men in the street corners, and he missed the markets, the alehouses, the gambling dens, the bridges, the river, all of it. But he did not miss the watchmen who patrolled the streets, kicking the vagabonds and ordering them to move on. He did not miss his drunken dad beating his mother and breaking her nose, thrashing his sister and then thrashing him. Above all, he did not miss the hunger that was always there, squatting inside the pit of his belly, in the head and deep in the heart. "Do not talk to me of homesickness," Dick said. "Hunger is worse. Hunger makes you an outcast wherever you are, even in your own home. Hunger exiles from place, family, people. You belong to it, and nothing else belongs to you." "I do not love any place enough to go back to it penniless," he said. "For now, this is home. Look at Master Menefee, look at Master Thorogood," he added. "Not high-born men, and here they are, masters of servants and lands. How did they get here? Through guts and hard work. Why? Because they wanted to. Who helped them? Only themselves. And the place. This place, the newness of it, its size, its wildness, its riches, its beauty. Think about it, Tony." I did think about it as winter came on, the cold numbing the tips of our fingers, the snow making its way through our work boots and thin wool stockings. There's something about a year divided into seasons that makes one believe in cycles, a pattern of coming and going, departures and returns. Back in my homeland, there was only the heat and the rain. Now that it was cold weather in Virginia, the white snow dusted the earth, and the silence was so deep that it made our very thoughts audible. Dick dreamed through the long months. First, he would work off his indenture and get a few acres like Ganter. He would labor like no man has labored before. And one day he would be Master Hughes, owner of fine lands further down the river. He would name his farm, never mind, the name would come later. It would be a good name, like Hughes 100 or Richard's Hope. He could already see the bales of tobacco being rolled down to the river banks, the tobacco ship sailing up, the wife who would be a nice girl who'd come recently from England, not like the filthy trulls around here who would raise their petticoats and spread their legs for a penny or a drop of ale. And there would be their children, and then the children of their children. And the future rolled forward, a ribbony river. It spread itself out and wheeled through the sky the blue heron, like the blue heron, which took off from the marsh and flew up on the air strong and swift. Flynn too dreamt of running away, of mastering the Indian tongue, of moving west and north, where somehow life would be better, life had to be better. I dreamt of my return, of familiar sights and tastes and sounds, of my mother restored to life, of moving back, not just back in space, but back in time. So, to a time that had been before ships sailed and voyages started, where the world stood still, where there was only a salty land, a salty sky, and a sea. Bristol and Cuffy, these are the two Africans, surely their dreams were something like mine. They'd be surprised if I asked. They'd got used to me being standoffish, not a white boy, but less a black man than them. That's what they believed I thought of myself, and perhaps that's what they believed of me. They would not share their dreams with me. Mad March, who can tell what went through her muddled old head? But she's probably the only one of us content to be where she was at the moment, doing what she was doing with Sammy and me by her side. And little Sammy himself, he labored on in silence. I believe that Sammy had ceased dreaming. So I was trying to convey the sort of range of experiences, people like Dick who came in determined to make it and determined to establish a life for themselves in the new world, and Flynn, who is Irish, and this is actually based on someone I read about in the historical. I had to do a lot of archival reading for this novel. There was this Irish servant who was constantly planning on running away, and who believed that somehow once he learned what he thought of as the Indian tongue, that's the Native American language, he would go and get their help and they would help him run away. And this was the sort of delusion he had all his life. And then, of course, the Africans, because, of course, there were a number of, we are still very early on. Slavery is still not an institution in the United States, but I mean, not the United States at this point, in North America, but people were being brought over from Africa. What their exact status is a topic of debate among historians. Were they slaves? Were they servants? Historians debate this. And so they are there. And Mad March was inspired by the figure. It appears there were a lot of, again, I shouldn't say a lot, a few people who were mentally ill, mad, to use the language of the day. And their families did not know what, families in England just wanted to be rid of them and would put them on the ships and send them off. So it is really interesting to me to get an understanding of the different reasons people came. And so I tried to capture that. And as the novel goes on, my protagonist goes out west, a number of things happen. I mean, I won't summarize the whole thing for you. But what happens in the latter part of the novel is he becomes a physician's apprentice. I mean, the life of a tobacco servant is what is expected, but things sort of turn around and he becomes a physician's apprentice. And
so, quick question, not to interrupt you, but it sounds like you're talking about this journey of this young boy to not even manhood, right, where he's still young?
When he starts, yeah.
Yeah. So can you tell us a little bit about the choice to write this as an adult novel versus YA?
I could not write YA. I think it's as simple as that. Yeah, I'm simply not a YA author. It doesn't come. And I guess a YA author could do it too, but the style would have to be very different. I am invested in sort of more literary kind of style, and I'm sure a good YA author could do it. It's just not a talent I have. And I was very interested in writing about the historical process. I was interested in these larger questions of racism and colonialism and all of that. And sort of adult literary novel is what comes to me. It's my language. That's what comes to me. And there is also, I mean, I am a Shakespearean by training, and I try to weave Shakespeare into this novel. And because, I mean, a lot of people are not aware, but A Midsummer Night's Dream by Shakespeare actually features an Indian boy. A lot of people don't think about it, but I'm sure you're somewhat familiar with the plot, fairy king, fairy queen, right? And the little boy they're quarreling over is actually an Indian boy. He's referred to as a changeling, but if you read the play, he comes from what is today India, spices and all that, there's a reference to. And so I have Tony actually watching the play. And when I first read about the Indian boy, the fact he was Indian really struck me. And I thought, how strange that you have an Indian boy in this very English play, you know, in the middle of the woods and whatnot. And I was very interested in his place in the play. And also at a more emotional level, I was, how lonely. You know, there are the mortals, there are the fairies, and then there's the Indian boy who doesn't belong to any group. And that is true of the East Indian of the novel. He's not black, he's not white, he's not native, you know, he's just sort of floating in his own. And so I weave Shakespeare and the Indian boy quite a bit into the novel. And the latter part of the novel, as I said, maybe the last 1/3 or so, he does become a physician's apprentice. And a couple of people, even my editor, weren't sure. They said, could that have happened? Because it's of course fiction, but I try to work within the realm of possibility. I cannot say probability because who knows, but possibility. These things could have happened to the protagonist. And people said, could a little Indian boy, you know, a boy who is not white, could he have become a physician's apprentice? Could that even have happened? But when you look at the English records of East Indians in London, it's very interesting. There's one Indian woman in London who's referred to as a surgeon. I don't even know what to make of that. This is about the year 1620. And she's actually referred to as a surgeon in London. And there is another Indian boy who is a physician's apprentice in London. And it appears he engaged in this little side business of selling magic potions, love potions. And his master, to punish him, shipped him off to Virginia. So I kind of drew from that. And so the last part of the novel is the Tony becomes, and of course I had to do a lot of reading and on the wild and wonderful world of colonial medicine, which is really quite a bizarre, and I mean, it's amazing how anyone even came out alive after, but I mean, the strange treatment, and of course one of the things that was considered best for your health was tobacco. Yeah, tobacco was, but there is this, Tony carries with him this little substance from London. And in London, it's being, he goes to an apothecary store in London, and in London, it's being marketed as unicorn horn powder from India. And by the way, this was a commonly prescribed medicine back in the day. Unicorn horn powder, and it could cure everything from the plague to syphilis to malaria to madness. Yeah, and so that was, and he steals it on an impulse, really, and he brings it with him all the way to America, and for some reason he hangs on to it. So when I refer to the powder, it's a reference to the little powder that he stole. And okay, so this is, he's in a little bit of trouble at this point in the story, and he's right in Jamestown, of course, in Virginia, right? And this is the incident that kind of changes the course of his life, and he moves into becoming an apothecary's assistant. Sleep evaded me, and I stepped out into the Jamestown night, slipping on Master Walsh's jacket because a chilly breeze was blowing from the river. A group of men bathed in the ghostly moonlight barged by, singing a bawdy song. I walked on, and would have walked further when I heard a hiss and felt a dagger slip pressed to my side. Giving someone the slip A, the man said, and I noticed that his mouth reeked of decay. For a minute, I thought it was Ganter, till I saw it was a much younger man. He held his weapon in one hand and a cup of drink on the other. I trembled where I stood. He raised the knife and pressed its point to my cheek. He wanted to mark me before he left. Turk, eh? Was it wiser to say yes to that, or to deny it, or to keep mum? Before I could speak, the most peculiar thing happened. The stranger dropped both his knife and cup to the ground with a clatter and began to wring his hands as if they were on fire. I would have picked up the weapon, but he placed his foot on it quickly, although he continued flapping his hands. And he then fell to scratching one palm with the nails of the other, and even retrieved his knife and scratched with its tip till his skin began to break and bleed. I should have run then, but he was a sight to behold, this man in a torment of itching, with his bleeding palms and expression of agony. I found myself rooted to the spot. He saw me gaping. You know what it is, this affliction? He groaned. I nodded, because he seemed to expect me to know, although I had no notion. Yes, 'tis exactly what you think. The clap, the French disease, call it what the fuck you will. I got these everywhere. Sores on my hands, in my mouth, on my back, even in my bloody shithole. And the itch comes on all of a sudden and takes over my body, it seems. And then it goes, till it comes again. The itching seemed to have abated a little. I cursed myself for not fleeing when I had the chance. He would rob me of my coin now and of my coat too, and then he would knife me. I thought quickly. I possess something that might help you, master, I said, my voice trembling just a little. To this day, I cannot say where those words come from. What is it? He asked, holding his knife with one hand and reaching behind to scratch his back with the other. It's the best physic for your condition. It's unicorn horn powder from India. And what are you, a Moor who's master of physic? The son of a physician and formerly an apprentice to a London doctor, I lied. This cure's used in East India and was vouched for by my English master who knew much about these things. And I reached into my pocket and I took out the little pouch. East India, eh? This looks like commonplace flour to me, he said suspiciously, as I tapped some of the powder into his outstretched palm, which I saw was marked with darkened spots that I was to learn later were palmar lesions, the result of advanced syphilis. It's a physic meant to heal the clap. I assure you it will aid you, I said, with all the conviction I could muster. Give me the whole lot then, he demanded, aggressive once more. Yet again, I thought quickly. If I gave him all the powder, he might rob me and then murder me just to round it up. This will last you all of 2 days, sir, and then where would you be? You need to take this every day between one full moon and the next to feel better. Let me go home and you return to me in the morrow for more. He looked uncertain but tipped the powder into his mouth and quaffed what little ale was left in his cup to send it down. Where do you bide? He asked. I told him there was no point in lying. He would find me easily enough. I will come by tomorrow, and mind you, I will kill you for the piece of filth you are if this proves of no avail. I assure you it will give you relief, I said, and turned around hurriedly to go to my pallet on the parson's floor. I could feel the stranger's eyes on my back as I retreated. I could almost feel the very air about him smouldering with his disease. So this, and of course, the sailor does not survive. I did not want to make the claim that unicorn horn powder from India can cure syphilis, but the sailor does die eventually. But a series of events happens after this, and Tony ends up being hired by a physician and serves as his apprentice. So that is essentially where. Do you have other questions? Or
I have a couple actually. But just as a side note, I find it extremely humorous that the first documented South Asian would come to this country and enter the field of medicine. So, you know,
that was a joke too. I'm glad you caught it. I think a fellow South Asian would get the joke.
Unbelievable.
Yeah. No, it was a bit of an inside joke because, right. I mean, I think, I mean, that's what every South Asian immigrant has to be. If your child doesn't become a doctor, you're an abysmal failure to this day.
And even this guy managed without parents on his back.
Without parents on his back, he managed. Yeah.
Why did you locate the boy at in the Coromandel Coast?
Because I'm from there. Partly I'm from there, but no, there's more to it than that. First, it's the coast, and most likely the young man came from a coastal city because that's where the East India Company had their settlement, and so it would have been most likely either Bengal or further down south, Tamil Nadu, you know, and the oldest East India Company settlement is Armagon, which is today in the state of Andhra, and which is about few hundred miles north of what Madras eventually became Madras. So I started his life there, moved him to Madras because Madras is again, along with Calcutta, one of the oldest settlements. So it's probable he does come from. And the first Indian who's, and this is of course much later in the 1770s, the Indian who's recorded as having fought in the American Revolution, he is identified as being born in Madras. So I pulled all of this together and put him on the Coromandel Coast, yeah.
But you didn't have more information about this particular Tony, right? Just the name?
Just the name, and he's on...
Everything else is reconstructed?
Everything else is reconstructed. Like I said, I mean, of course, it's fiction. I could have done anything, right, more or less, but I am the kind of author who takes, I'm ready to tweak the historical, but I'm not ready to completely distort it. So everything that happened could have happened. That's the way I approached it.
What was his actual name? This Tony
we don't know.
Killing me.
We don't know.
But you must know.
I know in one version of the novel, I mean, one editor said, let's do the grand reveal of his name at the end, but I did not want to. I said he has become Tony. For the course of this novel, he's become, I mean, for the course of his life now, really, he's become Tony. He's changed. Whatever other name was there, and it's lost and forgotten. So,
because it's the name and the religion. The religious connotation of the name Tony that is also changed.
Yeah,
right?
he does convert. I mean, he does convert. But most of the East Indians in London were also converts. Many of them converted to Christianity. But the one thing I like to also point out to a lot of people is Christianity is not a colonial imposition in India. I mean, the first Christians, I mean, Indians were Christians before the Portuguese and the English became Christian, because St. Thomas, the Apostle of Christ, came to India and he converted people around Madras, the Coromandel coast. And so, I mean, I hate this new discourse of, this going around in India of, Christians are foreigners and outsiders and colonial and so on. Christianity is an Indian religion, just as Islam is an Indian religion. And so he does not convert before, but he's surrounded by local converts, people who have converted. And actually, one of the first East Indians taken from was Peter. He was given the name Peter Pope. I think it's almost a joke, the name. And he is taken to London and he's baptized, and he is actually becomes fluent in both English and Latin. And he is sent back to India to continue the missionary work. And but he was considered, I mean, even his teachers in London talk about his expertise in both English and Latin. And but in this story, Tony converts in Virginia. He's not converted earlier, but he converts in Virginia. And he converts as a matter of survival. He converts, because that's what he is now in this new place. Yeah.
You mentioned a moment ago, actually, historical accuracy, right? You're willing to tweak the narrative, but not too far, Given what his mother did for a living, how possible do you think that would have been for the son of a
courtesan?
Yeah.
I think actually more possible than for someone from a respectable middle-class family, because these were the only women who really had any degree of interaction with the white people. Because the East India Company officers who came to India, they had Indian mistresses. And who were the mistresses? I mean, they were not middle-class, respectable, upper caste people. They were people from the courtesans. And actually, the whole thing came about because the city of Madras, which is one of India's oldest cities, was really a creation of the British, founded by the British. The founder of Madras is this Englishman named Francis Day. And why he founded the city, where he founded it, is, of course, it's a convenient harbor and a convenient port and all of that. But what he writes in one of his records is he had a mistress, and he says, I decided to build the East India Company fort here so my interviews with her can be frequent and uninterrupted, is what he says. And so I used that little bit and said, oh, there was an Indian mistress, and that's going to be Tony's mother. Yeah. So I try to root it in history, and I think some of it is recognizable to some readers. It's not recognizable to other readers, but I think overall, I think every American knows something about Virginia and the founding of Virginia and the settlement of Virginia. So I hope, they can engage with the novel at that level. And it's quite incredible, I think, that an East Indian, had a place in that story. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
How did you decide on the first person? When do you know that that's the way to tell the story as opposed to other?
One, I think it's just easier, I think it's just easier because it's almost like you're talking, and there's that. But I think the first person also allows you to play a little, because it's an adult looking back and telling. And it allows you to play a little bit with memory and what one remembers and what one forgets and what one chooses to remember. And I think a first person narrative allows for some of that, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Did you choose the title?
I did, yeah, I did.
Can you say a little bit more about that? Because it's historically, obviously, the correct terminology, but in this day and age, it runs the risk, of course, that you're aware of perpetuating the...
Yeah. Well, because in the record, he's Tony East Indian. That's it, His name is Tony East Indian. And so I just decided to use East Indian. And whenever there are references later in mostly where do you find, I have an article on this actually in History Network on the, it's a sort of non-fiction article on East Indians in colonial America. Mostly Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, few of them in South Carolina, and where do they appear? They appear in runaway servant ads. They were constantly trying to run away. It appears like all servants. They appear in property inventories, and they appear in court cases. It's really interesting where they are suing for freedom. And suing for freedom from what, right? From slavery or from indenture. Are they trying to break the bonds of indenture? It's really quite interesting. And in all of them, they are referred to as the East Indians. I just decided to. At first, it jarred. The term, when I was using it, it really sort of bothered me. And cause I don't think of myself as East Indian. But that's the term that stuck eventually. Yeah. So, maybe I'll read just a little bit more. Yeah, is that... Right. Okay, just a little bit. Maybe we'll end on a slightly, not rib-ticklingly funny, but slightly funny note which tells you something about colonial medicine at this time. So anyway, he goes back home. He goes back to the house of the parson in Jamestown, and this is shortly after he meets the sailor with syphilis, and he gives him the unicorn horn powder. And the sailor who had stepped up from the dark, the pox-ridden man, turned out to be a sailor named Noah Giles. He accosted me on Parson Blair's doorstep as I returned from my reunion with my friends. You, the Moor, with the corn powder stuff? Yes, the unicorn horn powder from India, I said calmly enough, although I was dismayed. Had he returned to knife me for deceiving him? I have come for the second dose you promised me, he said. It was potent, although it is but Moorish medicine. I've had attacks of the itches every hour, it seems, since this thing I caught from a whore in Spain took me. But since I took the stuff, I barely felt yucky. And look, he stuck out his palms at me. The sores did not look any different than they had looked in the moonlight. In truth, they appeared worse. In the glare cast by the lantern, I shone straight on them. But I was not one to tell Noah Giles that. I fetched a 2-day supply of the powder from my little store, and he took it gladly. I was in the mind to kill you last night, he said cheerfully as he left. I cannot bide tawny Moors and such. The whore in Spain was one, from Algiers methinks. By the way, this was the term used for East Indians, the tawny Moor. Tawny to describe the sort of brown skin. I cannot bide tawny Moors and such. The whore in Spain was one, from Algiers methinks. But 'tis good I let you be. I thanked him for his clemency, and after he left, I went on to tell Parson Blair, who had already sent Maria to the door to see what the chatter was about. They were much taken by my tale and wanted to inspect the medicinal powder for themselves. And the rest of this description of medical anecdotes is all historical. So Maria declared she had heard say of people being cured of things worse than the French disease. And she told us of a maiden in Santo Domingo who had vomited a green thing long and thick as a grown man's finger, which had wings, a great many feet, and a turned-up tail, and had taken off in flight after it emerged from the maiden's insides, and how she had administered handfuls of chalk to flush out the parts of the creature that had remained inside her. Parson Blair was inclined to dismiss Maria's medical miracle, but he had a story of one Thomas Parr Englishman who had lived to the great age of 152 and even kept a mistress, a woman aged 5 and 30, when he himself turned 100. His extraordinary health was attributed to his lifelong diet of sub-rancid cheese, coarse bread, and sour whey. Does he still live? I asked interestedly. Sadly not. The good King Charles went to meet this ancient subject of his and summoned him to London. Master Parr, it appeared, gave up the ghost the day after the royal audience on account of the rich viands and strong drink he feasted on in the palace kitchen. Maria did not see how the parson's tale was about the wonders of modern physic. The parson retorted that it was about the wonders of diet, the wonders of rancid cheese in particular. I deliberated on how much of the powder I had left to keep Noah the sailor satisfied. If he kept returning every day until I left for my new post at Master Johnson's, I would be forced to seek out a unicorn, slaughter it, and grind down its horn. So thank you. And by the way, the green thing, the rancid cheese, the guy who lived 152, they were all part of the colonial medical record. So that's where I stole all that from. So it was actually a lot of fun to read all that. Yeah, crazy, but fun. So thank you. Thank you so much for coming. And thank you to my friend Jeff for suggesting I come here. So Jeff, who's a native of the area.
I'm a native.
So do you have any final questions? Or?
What are you working on now?
Well, I'm working on a second novel, which is set in, I like historical fiction. That's what it comes easily to me, and I'm fascinated by the past, and it's and how we all, in some sense, bear the legacy of past centuries. And this is set in it's 1815, so it's about 40 years after the young republic. America has just become the United States, and it's actually set a little bit closer to where I'm located. It's set in Boston, and it's the world of the performing arts, magic, stage magic in particular, because it was a truly international world where you have magicians. Magic was the big entertainment, back in the day, big entertainment, and magicians were really the superstars of their time. And so it's set in the world of these foreign magicians who come to Boston to perform, and the working title is Hocus Pocus, but who knows, yeah. And it's also given me a chance, I think, the novel, to explore themes of ambition, especially ambition in the arts. I've been thinking a lot about it since doing the book, and engaging with the world of publishing and writing, and writers tend to be terribly egoistical and terribly ambitious both, and so it got me interested in what is it to be successful in the arts, what is ambition, and what will one compromise for the sake of success. So that's some of the themes I'm exploring in the historical background of the early 1800s. Yeah.
So how do you know that you've read enough of the archive and the history books and things like that, that you can start writing the novel? What makes you decide, okay, because it looks like there's always something more you could put.
It is, and you keep going down rabbit holes. I do not know. Frankly, I do not know. And I guess that's the academic in me, because I find other fiction writers are okay with reading a little bit and starting, but the academic in me is too aware of all that I do not know. I think it's just time. At some point, you have to say enough is enough. You just have to get down to writing. If not, you're going to spend, But honestly, for this novel, it took me about double the time to read as to write. Yeah, I spent years actually researching the thing. But I think at some point you just have to say, what I know, and what I don't, I'll take the risk. Yeah.
Your earlier books are published in India?
And England.
And England? Are they available here?
I think some are. Okay. Yeah, India and England, yeah. But this is the first one really, actually. I've written short stories set in the United States, but in terms of a full-length novel, this is the first, yeah. Great. Thank you for coming out on a beautiful day when I'm sure there are nicer things to do. And thank you. Thank you.